The compass touched the ground before the woman. Mrs. Edith Lovelace, once of a resolute demeanor and a forced smile, collapsed mid-stride in the center aisle of St. Luke's Church, her eyes wide with terror and her face purple before the hymn even began. Miss Marple, sitting just 2 pews behind her, was already rising when the brass object rolled to her feet. A simple navigational compass, its lid open, its surface stained with something faintly green. "Poison," he whispered, leaning down beside the body without hesitation. "Fast-acting, possibly digitalis or belladonna." Around him, the congregation dissolved into gasps and confusion. Someone shouted. The organ fell silent. Then another gasp. At the altar, Reverend Harold Dunn clutched his stomach and staggered backwards, knocking over the baptismal cup as he collapsed behind the pulpit. Miss Marple's head jerked up. 2 bodies, 2 methods, 1 location, and the killer was still here. "Close the doors," he barked, his voice cutting through the rising panic. "Now!" The 3 young men closest to the exit froze as they fled. Miss Marple walked towards the altar, observing every detail with her eyes. Reverend Dunn was convulsing, not yet dead. She turned it over carefully, noticed the faint stain on the edge of his robe's collar and smelled it. Chloroform? No, this was ingested. He looked at the communion chalice, already overturned. A note fluttered beneath her. She grabbed him. "True north is the first to fall." She read it twice, even as parishioners surrounded her, growing confused. Mrs. Lovelace, widow of a devoted former sailor. The compass, the phrase. Someone was hunting according to a system. It's not a personal revenge. Symbolic, ritualistic, and they had attacked twice in less than 90 seconds. He turned, his gaze fixed. "Has anyone come out of the collapse?" A voice answered from the side door. "Just Mr. Barstow. He said he had a weak bladder and slipped out before we sealed the room." Miss Marple clenched her jaw. Barstow, the sexton, quite forgettable. And possibly a murderer, or a witness, or worse, the next victim. She marched directly to the sacristy. Empty. A trail of blood along the stone floor led to a back exit. But nobody. She checked the latch and forced it open. "Someone wanted to get in or out quickly," he muttered. Then, behind her, another voice. "Miss Marple, come quickly." She returned to the ship. Mrs. Lovelace's body had been moved. She lay stretched out on the altar steps, her arms crossed over her chest, and in your hand, a second compass. This one broke, and the needle spun wildly. Miss Marple did not blink. This was not a random act of violence. It was a message, and the murderer was climbing positions. The police arrived within 5 minutes, but the crowd had already become violent. Rumors of a curse spread through the cemetery, fueled by the symbolic placement of the body and the cryptic note. Inspector Graves, a competent man but too slow for the urgency, took the statement and failed to grasp what Miss Marple had already concluded. "He's a serial killer," she said flatly, taking him aside, "possibly related to maritime rituals or navigation codes. It wasn't personal, it was planned." Graves sneered. "You saw 2 victims collapse. It could be a coincidence." "Coincidence," he said, "rarely involves riddles, compasses, and 2 different toxins administered in less than a minute." Graves didn't argue further, but he didn't act quickly enough either. So did Miss Marple. He returned home and began to make the list. Goals. Not based on motive. Based on the symbol. Mrs. Lovelace. Widow of a Royal Navy captain. Reverend Dunn. Spiritual north of the parish. If the killer was choosing symbols of orientation, north, compass, faith, then the next one would be someone who leads silently, he said aloud. She stood up and picked up the phone, but before he could score, the glass broke in the kitchen. She fell to the floor when something hit the door frame behind her, a crossbow bolt, primitive, Silent. Airplane. He didn't move for 5 seconds. Then he slowly stood up, grabbed the curtain rod above the sink, and dragged himself to the door. Outside, only the wind. But the lightning had struck intentionally. This time, there was no note. Just a folded piece of parchment tied to the spindle. The south fails next. The compass breaks before the village bends. His heart raced. She scanned the note again. On. It is not the name of a person, a position, or an address. She flipped through her notebook and found it. Mrs. Gladys Hornby, president of the Southern Women's Guild. Addressed. She ran. When he arrived at Mrs. Hornby's cottage on Poplar Hill, the sun was setting. The door was ajar. Inside, the teacups were still warm, but the house was empty. Miss Marple examined the walls. Photographs, old medals, and an inherited compass on the mantelpiece. One of the teacups was crooked. She came closer and smelled it. Mandrake, another plant toxin, fast-acting, but the cup was intact. He turned to the window just in time to see a figure in a dark coat watching from across the street. Stop. Still. Then he left. Miss Marple didn't chase him. She called the police. Trace Miss Hornby's known contacts, he told Graves when he arrived. Send an alert to nearby hospitals. If she's alive, they'll bring her in. If not, they're already dropping her off somewhere. Graves sighed. Do you think this is a ritual? I think we have less than 48 hours before the entire town becomes a compass without a needle. On his way home, he found the second screw embedded in the garden wall without blood. Just another note. The East does not fail in the church, but in the home of knowledge. She knew it immediately. The headmistress of the primary school, Miss Eliza Cairn. The village's East Gate, both figuratively and literally. The school was located on the parish boundary, marked on old maps as East Watch. He had no time to rest. This killer wasn't waiting for dawn. They were following the compass, and it was turning faster. At school, the lights were on. Miss Marple arrived just in time to hear a scream echo around the courtyard. He ran as fast as his legs could carry him to the office. Inside, Miss Cairn was fighting a masked figure. Miss Marple threw a book at the attacker. Useless but distracting. Enough time for the woman to kick herself free. The attacker disappeared down the fire escape. Miss Marple steadied the headmistress as blood trickled from the woman's scalp. Then he turned around and found a compass lying on the desk. Her needle stuck. Stuck, pointing south. 3 warnings, Miss Marple said aloud. The north is gone. The south is missing. The east was practically silent. West, he whispered, is next. She looked up, and he realized that he already knew who it would be. The library stood silent and dim at the western end of St. Aldrich's, its worn weather vane creaking on the roof. Miss Marple arrived shortly after 6 in the morning. The sky was dull grey above the thatched cottages. Her breath caught as she stepped onto the narrow stone path. She had come alone. There was no time for guards. There was no room for doubt, because west could now only mean one person. Mr. Lawrence Peakshead, librarian for over 3 decades, a man who prided himself on cataloguing not just books, but also people, conversations, and sins. Miss Marple tried to open the door. Blocked, but a light flickered inside. He knocked once, twice, and then used the edge of his umbrella to tap on the leaded window. No response. The third knock produced a flash of movement behind the curtain. She took a step back as the door creaked open. Mr. Peaks leaned forward, his glasses sliding down his long nose. Miss Marple? What the hell? You're in danger, she said, pushing him roughly. Someone's crossing the compass. You're west. You're next. He blinked. Compass. She closed the door behind her and locked it. Lovelace was to the north. Dunn, the moral center. Hornby to the south. Cairn to the east. You are the last cardinal. This isn't personal, it's thematic. Mr. Peaks nervously adjusted his tie. But what would I have done to deserve all this? It's not about guilt, he said. It's about symbols. About the order. They kill according to a structure. And the pattern is almost complete. He stepped back toward his desk. Should I call the police? They will be too slow. I have a panic button behind the counter. A loud bang on the side window silenced them both. Miss Marple walked to the edge of the blinds and looked out. A figure, dark coat, motionless, watching. Then he left. There's no time for bellboys, he said. Go now, out the back, through the archive exit. But I'm following you. Now. Peaks ran into the narrow corridor. Miss Marple followed close behind him but stopped dead in her tracks. They had taped a compass to the inside of the office door. His face cracked. The needle was pulled out. Scribbled below in pencil, the compass ends, but the wheel begins. I didn't need any more proof. The killer had already moved from the cardinal points. They were moving on to something else. A new pattern. They reached the alley behind the library just as a shadow detached itself from the back wall. Miss Marple knocked Peaks to the ground as a knife arced through the air, grazing her shoulder and slicing into her sleeve. She kicked back, hitting the attacker in the shin. A grunt, then retreat. He disappeared into the mouth of the alley before she could chase him. Peaks gasped. Oh my God! He was going to kill me! Miss Marple pressed the handkerchief against his shoulder. You're not dead yet. But he's accelerating. He didn't ride it. He improvised. She helped him to his feet. Which means, he murmured, that we're standing before him. Back at the station, Inspector Graves was finally convinced. 4 victims in 2 days. 2 dead and 2 injured, and all marked with compasses and navigational aids. He opened a map of St. Aldrich and pointed out the attack sites. They formed a cross. North, Lovelace, Graves murmured. South, Hornby. East, Cairn. West, Peaks. What now? Miss Marple pointed to the note she had taken from the library. The wheel begins. That's not a cardinal point anymore. It's rotation. It's a sequence. Graves frowned. A wheel? She nodded. A compass is a tool, yes. But a wheel suggests movement, turns, cycles. Do you think he's restarting the pattern? No, she said. I think he's adding layers. He's finished the dots. Now he's moving on to the intervals, the diagonals. Graves stared. Diagonal? Northwest, northeast, southwest, southeast, intercardinal. 4 new deaths. Graves cursed under his breath. He's duplicating the pattern. Miss Marple's voice was firm, and we're barely catching up. They divided the map again. Miss Marple headed northeast. This led her to Rosegate Farm, the home of retired cartographer Helen Durant. A woman without enemies, with a passion for star charts and a lifelong obsession with compass roses. She wasn't home. The gate to his garden was open. Inside, her cat meowed from the counter. A cup of fresh tea steamed next to a half-written letter. Miss Marple's gaze was fixed on the window. Something flashed in the glass. She came closer. A compass-shaped brooch. It hung from a nail, suspended in the sunlight. Then his eyes turned downwards. A shadow, just beyond the back hedge. She was being watched. She didn't flinch. She spoke loudly, calmly and clearly. I see you. No movement. But I've seen enough to know you've changed your method. You're not just acting out death. You're composing it. There is still no response. He turned away from the window and opened the pantry door. Mrs. Durant was inside, tied up, unconscious, but alive. Miss Marple exhaled. It's reached the point of kidnapping. She called for reinforcements. There is no answer. He led Mrs. Durant to the porch and waited with a kitchen knife in his hand. The shadow did not return. Hours later, Durant was revived and stabilized. Inspector Graves stared at the compass-shaped brooch, now marked as proof. She was marked, but not dead. Miss Marple nodded. The murderer was interrupted. "Why not take her then?" "He wants the bodies found," he said. "They're messages. Miss Durant wasn't part of the original group. She's the first of the second wave. This wheel isn't about orientation anymore. It's about rotation, repetition, momentum." Graves frowned. "So what's the next phase?" She reached into her bag and pulled out a page torn from an old maritime almanac. "The mariner's compass," he said, "has 32 points. Graves paled. "Do you think he's planning?" She interrupted him. He's not planning 32 murders. He's using structure, the implication of precision, control, ritual. "And the widow's compass?" he asked. "Why did it get that name?" He tapped the original compass that had fallen next to Edith Lovelace's body. "I think she was the seed. The anchor point, the widow whose husband commanded a ship called the Compass. That's where it all began. That ship veered off course in 1963. This killer isn't just obsessed with direction, he's obsessed with correctness. Graves was a pretty long moment, so how do we catch someone who maps their deaths like a cartographer?" Miss Marple looked into his eyes. "We redrew the map before he did. Back in his cabin, he pasted his own map on the wall. It's not about roads or houses, but about names, stories, and grievances. Old committee lists, parish registers, naval logs, and at the center of it all, a faded photo of Captain Lovelace, holding a compass in his gloved hand." Miss Marple whispered, "It wasn't just murder. It was a correction." She took a step back, and he realized that the killer did not target sins. "I was pointing to the legacy of a lie." The attack occurred shortly before midnight. Miss Marple was awakened not by the creaking of floorboards or the sound of a broken window, but by the metallic tinkling of something small hitting her bedroom door. She sat down slowly, her mind already moving, a sound too precise to be random. She stood up, put on her robe, and crossed the room with a measured gait. Her hand hesitated on the doorknob. Then another sound, a whisper of fabric. Movement, just on the other side of the door. She didn't open it. Instead, he went to his desk, opened the drawer, and took out the small whistle that Inspector Cray had given him. A discreet device connected to a silent alarm at the station. She pressed him once. A red flash confirmed the signal, but the murderer was no longer waiting. Smoke rose from under the crack in the door, the unmistakable smell of burnt wool. Miss Marple did not hesitate. He turned, threw open the window, and threw a heavy bookend into the yard with a loud thud that alerted the neighbors. He then grabbed the fire extinguisher from the hall closet and turned just as the bottom of the door burst into flames. She sprayed. The hiss of chemical foam filled the room, thick and choking, but it worked. The flames went out. The murderer fled. When Inspector Cray and 2 officers arrived, she was sitting on the edge of her bed, still holding the fire extinguisher in both hands. She didn't look up when he entered. "The pattern has changed," he said. "We are no longer symbols. We are threats." Cray took a step forward. "He came after you." She nodded. "Because I broke the sequence. I saved the West. I disrupted the Northeast. I altered the design." Cray looked at the burn marks around the door frame, then at the small compass tacked into the wood. Miss Marple hadn't noticed until now. It was neither cracked nor broken. It was perfectly intact. Its needle pointed west, but the label underneath said, "Interference." She whispered the word out loud. "He doesn't see me as a point on the wheel, but as a force outside of it." Cray clenched his jaw. "Which means he'll try again." "Yes," she said. "And next time, He won't use fire. She was taken to the vicarage under protection, but Miss Marple knew better than to trust police patrols or locked doors. It was no longer a question of location. This was personal. So he went back to the beginning. The widow's compass. Mrs. Lovelace. Miss Marple asked herself the simplest question of all. What has changed recently in Edith Lovelace's life? And the answer came from the tea house. Mrs. Lovelace had stopped ordering her usual Darjeeling and had switched to a rare Siberian black, a strange and sudden change of habit. When asked about it earlier in the investigation, Beatrice, one of the waitresses, simply said, "Oh, she said she was feeling homesick." Nostalgic. Miss Marple wrote down the word. Then he circled it. There were other small changes too. A reorganized living room, a new compass-shaped brooch, donations to the church, all anonymous. Mrs. Lovelace was preparing for something, or someone. He retrieved the old naval log from Inspector Cray's files. HMS Orphean, 1963, commanded by Captain Alistair Lovelace. The ship veered off course during a training mission. The entire crew died. Official cause: navigational error due to a magnetic disturbance. Miss Marple blinked. Magnetic disturbance? But there were no storms, no sunspots, no follow-up research. He had been buried. Carefully. She leaned closer to the file. The last transmission of the Orpheus was recorded incorrectly. It indicated that the ship's position was 154 degrees west, but the call had been picked up by a listening station near the English coast. That wasn't a mistake. That was a lie. The ship had never left English waters, which meant the tragedy had occurred close to home. And if someone had discovered that cover-up, the compass was not just a motif, it was a map. Miss Marple took up the old parish map again and began to draw, not only the cardinal points, but the transmission arches. The direction of the attacks. The pattern no longer resembled a compass rose. It looked like a signal sweep, a rotation of the sonar. She whispered, "It's mimicking radar." Cray looked over his shoulder. "A radar?" "Yes," she said. "The killer is tracking the final route of HMS Orphean. Each death corresponds not to a direction, but to the ship's alleged positions in the falsified log. So what's next?" She drew the following arc. The position was pointed directly at Pine Hollow, the now abandoned property of the Orphean's shipbuilder, Reginald Hamerton. Miss Marple stood up. "I'm going alone." Cray bristled. "Absolutely not." "He's waiting for you," she said. "He's waiting for the police. But for me, he thinks he's shaken me. He thinks I'm damaged." She smoothed down her coat. "So I'll make him believe it, and I'll jump right into the storm." Pine Hollow was a skeleton of greatness. The iron gate hung broken. Ivy strangled the columns. The shattered windows stared, like blind eyes, into the gloom. Miss Marple entered carefully. The hall was quiet, but not still. The dust moved in a deliberate pattern, as if someone had swept a path to confuse the footprints. She followed him in the library. There, on the ground, was another compass. They took away his face. The mechanism was replaced by a recording device. She knelt down and pressed play. A voice, male, young, calm. "When they buried Orpheus, they buried us with him. You made the map. I followed it. You followed me. Welcome to the center." She looked around. The center. This is where it ended. The floor creaked behind her. She turned around, and I came face to face with a figure wearing a dark naval coat, gas mask, compass badge, gloves. He lunged. Miss Marple ducked, knocking over the lamp. The glass shattered. A sharp edge cut her palm as she scrambled backwards. He moved forward, silent and focused. She grabbed the compass recorder and threw it. It hit him squarely in the mask, breaking the visor. He staggered. She lunged for the fireplace poker, but before she could swing, he was gone, disappearing down the hall, his steps quick and retreating. A siren sounded outside. Cray arrived just as she staggered out the front door. "Did you see it?" he shouted. She nodded, bleeding. "He knows that I know now." Cray looked her up and down. "We'll get him." "No," she said. "I'll catch him." Because now I had the final piece. The killer did not only target symbolic figures, their target was those who benefited from the lie about Orpheon. And there was one more name on the official crew list of that ship. Miss Marple. An administrative error, surely. She had never served. But someone had falsified his name in the registry, which meant someone wanted her to pay for something she'd never done. The rain pounded the vicarage roof as mercifully as a funeral drum. Miss Marple, her left hand bandaged and her right clutching the copy of the falsified naval register, didn't bother joking as she burst into Inspector Cray's temporary command room. She dropped the folder on the table. "There's a name that doesn't belong to me," he said. "Mine." Cray, bleary-eyed and still reeling from Pine Hollow, looked up. "We assumed it was a clerical error." "It's not a mistake," he snapped. "It's bait. Someone is setting a trap for me. If I hadn't pulled Mrs. Henderson off her garden path 2 nights ago, she'd be dead, and I'd be the last person seen near her. They're positioning me." Cray exhaled. "You're saying the killer isn't just targeting you. He's framing you." "No," she corrected herself. "It does both." She opened the folder and turned it over. The forged ship's register included Edith Lovelace, Gordon Pike, Harold Hemsley, and Jane Marple. I never served, but I did correspond with someone on that ship. Briefly. In 1962, a young man named Blake Torrance. He was writing a book on naval ethics and looking for perspective. We exchanged 3 letters, then he disappeared at sea. She paused. "But this fake log suggests I was on board." "Why?" Cray narrowed his eyes. "To tarnish your credibility. Discredit your warnings. Or worse," he said, "painting me as the center of the deaths, the common thread." His voice strained. "And now I know who the next victim will be." Cray bowed. "Gillian Brower." Cray blinked. "The postmistress?" His father served aboard the Orpheon. He told me last week he'd found a trunk containing his old diaries and letters, sealed under the floorboards. He planned to hand them over to the archives, but he didn't show up for his morning shift yesterday. He didn't receive any messages. Not a word. "Is she dead already?" Cray asked. "No," said Miss Marple. "Because if it were, the murderer wouldn't rush into setting up the case for me. He needs one more act. One last public death to close the circle." Cray grabbed his coat. "We're leaving now." The post office was dark. The blinds were drawn. The back door was ajar. Miss Marple's shoes squelched in the wet gravel as she cautiously passed the bicycle rack. The small light from a flashlight reflected off the wall, illuminating the side window. It had broken. They entered in silence. The interior smelled of wet paper and copper, like damp envelopes soaked in blood. Cray took out his flashlight and examined the room. There, slumped on the sorting table, was a figure. Miss Marple ran ahead. Gillian Brower was alive, but barely. His wrists were bound with a string. A compass hung around his neck like a rope, his glass face cracked. His lips moved weakly. Box. The red box. Miss Marple turned to the locked cupboard near the window. A closet with 2 locks, a brass, an iron, both old. Neither was like the others I'd seen. Miss Marple stared for only a second before realization blossomed like fire in her breast. The locks were not just symbols, they were locations. "Cray, get her out of here. I need to open this." Cray hesitated. "You're bleeding." "I'm always bleeding," he said, kneeling down. She examined the locks. Brass, a standard glass, iron, a naval-style lock. He reached into his coat and pulled out a keychain, collected over the years, each one kept for no rational reason. One fit. The closet opened. Inside was a small cloth-bound book, a diary. She opened it. Blake Torrens, his handwriting, his letters, and one last chilling note. The Orphean never reached the sea. We were forced back by higher orders. We were told to stay in the logs, to bury what happened to Hamerton's son, to keep the magnetic testing program secret. The compass is useless for navigation. It's a wheel of punishment. Every lie throws it further off its axis. The widow knows this. She built the first cabinet. Miss Marple froze. Hamerton's son. The shipbuilder had mysteriously died weeks before the launch. The lie was not about the accident. It was about the cause, the test. Compasses were not symbols. They were scars. Each victim had inherited part of the truth. The killer was purging them, rebalancing the lie. Miss Marple turned the last page and saw a rough diagram, a spiral, with your name in the center. His heart stopped. Cray burst in. He'll survive. We've already notified him. What did they find? She showed him the page, and then he turned it over, revealing one last line. You're wearing the wrong shoes. She stared at him for a moment. Wow. When you got to Pine Hollow, what did you notice? He shrugged. Broken door, shattered windows, footprints. Boots or shoes? Cray thought. Shoes. Heavier than you expected. But clean. Too clean, he said. She stood up, almost dropping the newspaper. He pretends to be someone else. Someone with a motive to sneak into each scene unseen. He lifted the broken compass from around Gillian's neck. It was a duplicate. Cray looked at her. Do you think he's one of us? I think he's hiding in uniform, he said. And we have to take the uniforms away from him before someone else dies. They returned to the station and declared a silent lockdown. Every agent, every volunteer, every inspector had to show their shoes, their uniforms, and their recent deployment records. It took 3 hours. In the morning, an officer had not appeared. Malcolm Greaves, a temporary agent incorporated during the summer influx, supposedly retired from naval intelligence. Miss Marple reviewed the file herself. There was no naval registry. There are no Greaves listed in service with the MOD, and no address in town. Made up, Cray whispered. He created an entire identity just to get close. And it's still within the village limits, said Miss Marple. Which means? He approached the large map on the wall, the same one they'd been using to record the deaths. One red pin was left unassigned. The center of the wheel. She put her finger on it. The old livery stables, now abandoned. He looked at Cray. He's preparing for the final act. The interior of the premises was very dark. The air is thick with dust and old hay. Miss Marple moved alone after insisting that Cray keep the recovered diary and Gillian. She needed to get the truth out of the killer. He held a box of matches in his hand. Inside, a piece of the original compass dial hidden in the archives. She lit a match. The flare illuminated rows of shelves, old tack, saddles, ropes, and a circle drawn in chalk on the ground, with 12 broken compasses surrounding it. She took a step towards the center. I'm here, she said. A door creaked open on the upper floor. Steps in the upper gallery, and then a voice. Familiar. You were always clever, Miss Marple. A man appeared before their eyes. The same dark coat, the same gas mask, but this time he was holding something different. A replica of her own bag, your fingerprints, his stolen scarf. I was building the last painting. You should have died in that fire, he said. But now you'll be the center of everything. He picked up the match, but this time she was ready. She threw the piece of glass. He cut away the mask, revealing, just for a moment, a clean-shaven face with eyes wide open in recognition. It's not Malcolm Greaves, Gordon Pike. Still alive. the one who was thought to be dead in Chapter 1. He staggered. She ran. And outside, the sirens were getting closer. This wasn't over, but now he had his face behind the mask. The morning mist clung to the rooftops of St. Hedwig's Row like a cloying fog of guilt. Miss Marple, her coat still singed at the hem by the stable fire, strode purposefully down the alley off Baker's Lane. Inspector Cray walked beside her, pale but alert, the fatigue in his eyes eclipsed by a flash of cold fury. "He faked his death," Cray muttered, almost to himself. "We had a body. It matched Gordon Pike's height and build, and even had a dental record." "There are no dental records," Miss Marple corrected. "Only assumptions. Remember, his own widow declared him dead, a woman who never produced a marriage certificate, who disappeared hours after the fire." Cray stopped. "Do you think she helped him set it up?" "I think she was his first compass," Miss Marple said, "the first to hold him accountable, and he silenced her for it. That was the key episode of his crusade." They turned the corner toward St. Margaret's School, its courtyard empty and its iron gates padlocked by police order. But the real urgency wasn't the children. She was the director. Miss Laura Simpkins was a meticulous woman, energetic, efficient, and faithful to procedures. She had also been a young naval assistant in the administrative office of the Orphean shipyard in 1962. Her testimony, discreetly recorded during a routine records review, suggested that she had noticed discrepancies in the logbooks and attempted to raise her concerns. 2 days ago, Miss Marple had sent him a discreet note requesting a meeting. No response. This morning, his office was dark. Miss Marple's stomach sank as she picked the lock with a borrowed hairpin, an old habit from her days as a wartime volunteer. The door creaked open. The first thing he saw was broken glass. A compass shattered on the floor next to the desk. The second was the overturned chair. Thirdly, a bloodstain under the windowsill. Cray walked past her and shouted, but the answer came in a shout, not from within. From outside. The playground hedge had recently been trimmed, its branches exposing a narrow passage behind the school. And there, huddled under the lattice arch near the maintenance shed, lay Miss Simpkins, barely breathing. Another compass hanging around his neck like a mark of death. But she was alive. Miss Marple sank down beside him and took his hand. The woman's lips moved. "He waited until I turned the dial." Miss Marple frowned. "Which dial?" Simpkins gasped again and then fainted. Cray radioed for medical reinforcements. Miss Marple examined the shed door. It was ajar, and inside, an old weather station hummed faintly. Among them, a custom-made antique barometric compass with hand-numbered dials. And one had been converted. No address to a name. One worn brass label marked D. Lytton. Cray returned. "She'll survive, barely. We'll take her to the hospital." "What did she say?" "He said he'd activated the system," said Miss Marple. "And then he attacked her." Cray squinted at the barometer. "That's not a meteorological instrument." "No," she said. "He's a scorekeeper. He assigns names. Victims, based on their knowledge, their guilt, or their defiance. This dial, this cabinet, is his totem. He's not just murdering. He's balancing a twisted internal scale." Cray stepped back, his face pale. "And Lytton?" "Derek Lytton," Miss Marple said. "Retired metallurgy expert. One of the engineers is responsible for shielding the ship's magnetic chamber. Still lives near the coast, alone, withdrawn." Cray looked at his watch. "It's a 2-hour drive, if Pike's looking for him now." Miss Marple was already moving. "Then we're down to 1. They drove with their sirens off and their headlights dimmed to protect themselves from the thickening fog. Lytton's house perched on the cliffs of Dovetail Ridge, a ruined villa half buried by ivy. Cray pulled out his revolver. Miss Marple led the way. The door opened with a creak without resistance. The front door was ajar. Inside, the floorboards groaned like restless spirits. A fire crackled in the hearth, and sitting next to him was Derek Lytton. Dead. The compass melted into the flesh of his palm. Her eyes open and looked directly at Miss Marple. On the mantelpiece, a half-written letter scribbled in thick strokes. Jane Marple warned me too late. She clenched her jaw. Cray cursed. We were minutes behind. He's speeding up. Miss Marple turned around. On the side table was a single envelope with an address written in cursive. To the one trying to stop the pendulum, she opened it slowly. Inside, a riddle. The widow knew it was pointing west, but they built it to face east. She died alone, but not in vain. She left her mark under the beast. Cray stared. What beast? Miss Marple's face paled. She knew it. The old inn, the Boar's Head Tavern. They returned under a blood-orange sky. The silhouette of the inn stood out against the horizon like a wound. Abandoned 5 years earlier after a fire, it had been declared a ruin, but never demolished. Pike must have used it as a hiding place. Miss Marple approached the entrance. It bore a carved image of a snarling boar's head. She came in. The smell of soot and mold assaulted his senses. There was a trap door under the hearth. She descended, and he found the sanctuary. Compasses, dozens, arranged in a spiral, each with a name crudely carved in the center. Lovelace, Brower, Simpkins, Lytton. Your name, in the center. A faceless wax figure, dressed in his clothes. Coat, gloves, hat. A dagger in the heart. Miss Marple stepped back. He's preparing an end, he said. He wants to execute me publicly. Not as revenge, but for an act. Cray's voice echoed from above. We found tire tracks. Fresh. He was just here. Miss Marple turned and saw him, wedged behind the wax doll. The royal compass. Worn out. Cracked. Still working. And below, a list of schedules. One remained. 11:52 Greenchurch. She looked at her watch. 11:41. They had 11 minutes. Church Green was the heart of the village. Families gathered there, even in times of panic, drawn by the familiarity. Miss Marple and Cray arrived breathless. The park was crowded. Children played under the watchful eye. The stalls had tentatively reopened. The fear hadn't disappeared, but routine had begun to reappear. And that's what Pike was counting on. Miss Marple scanned the crowd. Then she saw him. Without a mask, in civilian clothes, smiling, pushing a naval souvenir cart with signs offering wartime compass souvenirs. One for each soul. Miss Marple moved quickly. Too fast. He saw her. He ran. Cray chased him with the gun in his hand. The crowd dispersed. Miss Marple ran after Pike. No longer a decrepit observer, but a woman possessed. They turned a bend onto the old mill road. He stumbled. She reached out and grabbed his arm. He spun around and slammed her into the brick wall. Pain erupted in his side. He raised a compass as if it were a sword. "You took them from me," he whispered. "They died because of you," he gasped. "Number, they died because they forgot." He lowered the compass, but she was faster. She pinned a hat pin to his arm. He screamed. Cray approached him from the side. They fought, then silence. Later, as Pike was being loaded into the van, Miss Marple stood silently near the broken compass. It ticked once. Then he stopped. Cray joined her. He had a list of the latest victims, but only one name remained. She nodded. "Mine." He handed him the remains of the compass. "Why do you think he left it running?" She looked at him for a long time. "Because I wanted to remind myself that the past always comes back," he said softly. "But you forgot one thing." "What's that?" Miss Marple smiled with steely eyes. "May I not stop ticking either?" The sound of the chapel bells brought no comfort that morning. They weren't rung for prayer, but for monitoring the situation. a coded signal hastily agreed upon between Reverend Galsworthy and Inspector Cray. When the bells rang 3 times in succession, it meant lockdown. And now, as their chimes echoed off the slate roofs of St. Hedwig's village, the shutters slammed shut and mothers dragged their children out of the garden. Miss Marple stood on the rectory steps, her bruised ribs tightly wrapped under her coat. The events at Church Green had shocked the town, not only because of Pike's audacity, but because of how close he had come. Again. And it wasn't over. Inspector Cray, giving rapid orders over the radio, turned to her with grim efficiency. "We have checkpoints at the north and west exits and checkpoints on Hartley Lane. No one leaves without inspection. The vicar has allowed the parish hall to be used as a triage center. We are preparing maps, files, and witness records." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "That sounds very much like martial law, Inspector." "It's the only way to prevent another name from being added to your cabinet," he replied. "And frankly, Miss Marple, we can't afford to lose you." She gave him a firm nod and then looked outside. Despite the imposed order, panic spread. Not the screaming and torchlit kind. No, this was more subtle, more lethal. It was the silence before a riot, the terrified glances between neighbors, the quickened pace of villagers taking shelter in their homes, old rivalries surfacing like rot beneath cracked paint. And now, as Miss Marple knew, paranoia was as dangerous as the killer. Inside the parish hall, the atmosphere was tense. Agents moved between long tables covered with documents, photographs, and topographical maps. Cray had transformed the altar into a command post. The list of possible targets had grown. Almost all were connected in some way to the Orphean naval investigation. Miss Marple studied the list in silence. 10 names. There are already 4 dead. 2 are under heavy guard, and the rest scattered throughout the town. "Why didn't he attack again after Church Green?" Cray muttered, pacing. There was chaos. He could have escaped, but he didn't. He disappeared. Miss Marple held up the recovered compass. Its glass was cracked, and its needle was slightly trembling. "Because he wasn't alone," she said. "Look." He opened the back plate. Inside, faint scratches marked names, hand-engraved, but not all by the same hand. Different pressures, different angles, different styles of engraving. Cray blinked. "Do you have help?" "No," she said. "He has believers." That afternoon, Mrs. Dell, the baker's wife, reported that a stranger was trying to buy potassium cyanide from the gardening supply closet behind the co-op. 10 minutes later, Mr. Beale, the watchmaker, turned out of his workshop a man who had asked him if he could repair a wartime field compass with blood on the needle. And at dusk, someone set fire to the town hall's former maritime archive room. Half of the naval charts were destroyed before the firefighters arrived. Miss Marple and Cray stood in the ashes, watching the embers rise in the damp night air. "They're covering their tracks," Cray muttered. Miss Marple nodded. "And preparing the next steps. What are we up against?" She looked at him directly. "A cult of memory," he said. "It has built a mythology around guilt, around compasses as judgment, and now others are taking it forward." Cray stared into the flames. "Then we have to stop them before this village is completely destroyed." That night they initiated the Circle Protocol. It was something Miss Marple had only witnessed once before, during the war when sabotage was feared in a darkened coastal town. It meant that every household had to report its head count every hour. All visitors had to register. No store could sell knives, flammable liquids, or chemicals, and no one could be alone for more than 30 minutes. The villagers called it Compass Curfew. Meanwhile, Miss Marple spent the night poring over something Pike hadn't burned, the old 1962 register of the courts martial at the Portsmouth Naval Base. She found it wedged under the piano in the record office, blackened but intact. They had crossed out a name, They hadn't removed it. They hadn't redacted it. Crossed out. As if Pike had changed his mind. Lieutenant Eliza Redfern. She was the only woman on the list. His trial had been suspended due to an internal reclassification. There are no further notes. Miss Marple frowned. Redfern. Where had I heard that name? He stood up and crossed the room to a bulletin board, pulling out a photo pinned to the timeline. A small-town charity fair from 2 years ago. There, in the corner, serving tea behind the stall, was a woman with bright grey eyes and an unusual compass-shaped brooch. Miss Marple ran towards Cray. This woman. I need her address. Now. They arrived at Rosebriar Cottage shortly after 11:15 p.m. It was calm. Too calm. The curtains were drawn, but only one light burned in the living room. Cray gestured to his team to flank the sides. Miss Marple approached the door and knocked. After a moment, a crack opened. A woman's face appeared, aged and tense, holding a glass of sherry. I was waiting for you, he said. Lieutenant Eliza Redfern, or Mrs. Eliza Finch, as she was known in the village, sat with impeccable posture and her hands clasped. She admitted it easily. Yes, he was in the Navy. No, he'd never talked about it. Yes, he had participated in the Orphean logistics team. No, he hadn't testified. Yes, she knew Gordon Pike. But what surprised Miss Marple was his next statement. I was the first one he recruited. Cray tightened his grip on his pistol. Did you help him kill? No, Eliza said. I refused. That's why he betrayed me. Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. Why didn't he? Eliza's voice trembled. Because I told him it would be the last. What do you mean? He said that when he completed the circle, when everything was balanced, he would come back for me. And if he was still alive, I would know his mission had failed. Miss Marple approached. You were his anchor, his test of faith. Eliza nodded. Miss Marple turned to Cray. He's not going to escape. He's going to finish her off. Cray's face darkened. We need to secure this place. No one in or out. But Miss Marple looked again at the photo in her hands. The tea fair, the brooch. There was another woman with Eliza that day. She was wearing the same brooch. She grabbed the magnifying glass. It wasn't the same brooch. It was the same compass. Transmitted. Duplicate. Cray followed his gaze. Do you think Eliza gave it away? No, Miss Marple said slowly. I think he started something. Eliza remained silent. Miss Marple turned to her. You're not the last, he said. You're the founder. And then came the sound. A broken window, a roar of fire, the smell of paraffin. Cray lunged forward and pushed Eliza down. Miss Marple turned away as the flames raced through the curtains. Through the broken window, he saw them. 2 figures in dark coats. Each one holds a compass aloft as if it were a sacred symbol. The next few moments were chaotic. The officers stormed into the home fire extinguishers whistled, and villagers rushed to the alley as the fire spread. Eliza was rescued from the blaze, coughing. One attacker was captured. The other disappeared into the woods. And all the while, Miss Marple stood in the cold, watching the flames go out, the faces fade, and the smoke drift away into the moonlight. He is no longer a lone assassin, a doctrine, a belief system. The compass was no longer a weapon. It was a banner. Miss Marple knew she could no longer trust the systems to protect her. By dawn, Rosebriar Cottage had become a fortress. Sandbag barricades, police patrolling with rifles, and Eliza Redfern held in a locked room upstairs, guarded by 2 officers. But it didn't matter. The killer was no longer a shadow. He was a movement, and movements don't die when you close the door. I need to disappear, Miss Marple said quietly to Inspector Cray. Disappear completely. Cray almost dropped his tea. With all due respect, ma'am, you've already been stabbed, almost strangled, and now half the town wants to burn you alive because they think you know too much. The idea of you hiding is—" "It's necessary," she interrupted. "You need a ghost who can ask questions where the uniformed officers can't." Cray exhaled slowly, realizing he was right. "If Pike thinks I've run away," she continued, "the others will let their guard down. If they see me dead, they'll come closer. Then I'll listen to them." An hour later, Miss Marple was declared seriously injured in the fire at Rosebriar. Her absence was justified by a fake medical transfer to St. Hilda's Infirmary in Bath. But in reality, she was already walking along the forest path behind the church, wearing a tweed hunting cap, a grey workman's cloak, and soft-soled boots. Beneath the hem of her skirt, she concealed a compass of her own, its needle engraved to reflect the murderer's ritual markings. Now she wasn't just hunting. She was bait. Their first stop was the widow's cabin, not Eliza's. The other widow, the widow of Rear Admiral Harold Croft, Delphine Croft, died under mysterious circumstances a year earlier. The official cause of death was natural heart failure, but an autopsy was never performed. Delphine had been Pike's neighbor before her breakdown, and 2 days earlier she had attended every funeral, wearing the same scarf, the same gloves, and the same handbag, without changing her expression. Miss Marple approached, disguised as a traveling herbalist. She knocked twice. There was no answer. She knocked again, this time softly. The door opened with a creak. Inside, the air was thick with lemon polish and paraffin. The lace curtains fluttered. A single chair sat in the center of the room, facing an empty fireplace. Delphine appeared behind her like a ghost. "You shouldn't be here," said the widow. Miss Marple lowered her voice. "Then neither should you." Delphine's eyes fell on the embroidery on the wall, a compass rose embroidered with silver thread. "I was promised a new order," Delphine whispered. "A world where the guilty would be seen, where the needle would only point to those who deserve judgment." "You mean the compass chooses?" Miss Marple replied. The widow nodded solemnly. "He's not lying. But the hand that holds it can." Something flashed in Delphine's eyes. Miss Marple took a step forward. "I don't want to stop you. I want to join you." Delphine narrowed her eyes. "You were at the center of the purge. Why would the compass accept you?" Miss Marple opened her cloak to reveal the altered compass she was carrying. Delphine stared. "You bear the mark." Miss Marple said nothing. The widow closed the door behind them and whispered, "Then you must know the cartographer." He lived under the barn. A man named Clem Yarrow, a former Ministry of Defense draftsman, was dismissed in disgrace for leaking naval plans. He spent years in isolation, living in the abandoned barn cellar, drawing maps for justice. Maps drawn not with roads, but with names. Each name is spelt out precisely and in a loop, each one connected by lines, cardinal points, and the locations of their crimes. When Miss Marple went down to the cellar, she found him hunched over a table lit by a lantern. Around him, hundreds of compass dials, each hand-painted, each with dates, initials, and directional values. He didn't look up. "I'm told you bear the mark," he said as ink spilt onto the parchment. Miss Marple placed her fake compass on the table. Yarrow finally turned around. His eyes were soft and distant, but behind them burned a fanatical purpose. He took the compass and turned it gently, watching the needle flutter toward magnetic north. "There's no deviation," he murmured. "It suits you." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Why?" Yarrow smiled. "Because you understand balance." "What does the compass do?" he asked. "Really?" He tapped a chart hanging above them. It showed names in a circle, each a dot. Each death followed a pattern, like a clock marking time. "There are 12, he said. "Pike chose the first 4, then others took up his mantle. When the circle is complete, justice will be absolute." "And then what?" The 13th is judged by the 12. Yarrow whispered. The founder must be heavy. Eliza Redfern. Yarrow stared at her. You know too much. I know enough. He stood up. Then come, the 11th compass turns tonight. Miss Marple travelled with them in silence. 3 brown-clad figures, their faces hidden, guiding her along the old coastal path that curved behind the naval cemetery. Their destination, Widow's Cliff. A solitary clearing on a cliffside, once used for bonfires, is now marked by 12 wooden poles forming a circle. 11 of them had burnt tips, ritual torches that were extinguished after each death. Only 2 remained off. Miss Marple entered the circle. A gathering awaited in the darkness, about 9 people, all veiled and silent. In the center, a woman dressed in ceremonial gray, the compass keeper. He turned to Miss Marple. Will you be passing sentence tonight? Miss Marple hesitated. Yes. The compass keeper held out a scroll. That night's goal. Miss Marple's hand trembled as she read the name. Edwin Chase, the local grocer, 65 years old. Mild-mannered. Former naval supply clerk. Your crime? He whispered. The Guardian pointed to a document pinned below the name. A diverted shipment. 6 men died. Guilt by compass. Miss Marple stepped back. Where is he now? The Guardian turned around. It's already taken. Miss Marple gasped. Number, no, this isn't the time. It must wait. But behind her, Clem Yarrow whispered. The compass has already turned. And then he saw the smoke. Miss Marple ran through the undergrowth, faster than she had in years. Twigs tore at her skirt. Blood stained her palm. But her mind raced faster than her feet. If Edwin were dead, they would light the 11th torch. That would leave 1, and Eliza would be summoned to trial. She burst onto the village road just as the alarm sounded. Cray's men ran toward the grocery store, where smoke was now rising from the rafters. Miss Marple pushed her way through the crowd as the villagers shouted. Inside, the smell of oil, of charred wood, of death. But it wasn't Edwin's body they pulled from the smoke. It was Inspector Cray. His uniform was charred, his left leg was broken, and he clutched something in his hand, a compass, its needle broken. Miss Marple knelt beside him, her heart pounding. He opened one eye. They knew I came here. For Edwin, Miss Marple whispered. So Edwin is still alive. Cray nodded weakly. They used you, he said, his fury growing, to complete the 11th point. And as the crowd gathered, someone lit the torch at Widow's Bluff. The 11th fire burned. Back in the cellar, Miss Marple stared at the ritual diagram. 1 name remained on the outer ring, only 1. And to his horror, he realized who it was. No Eliza, no Edwin, not even Pike. It was her, Jane Marple, the woman who interfered, the woman who refused to let the compass dictate her destiny. Miss Marple stood beside Cray's hospital bed as the rain pounded against the emergency room windows. The detective inspector's eyes were squinting. He was reeling from painkillers and smoke inhalation, but the words he'd managed to whisper before losing consciousness were clear. They knew I was coming because of the compass. They had provoked him, and it almost cost him his life, but that wasn't what worried her. What chilled Miss Marple's blood was what she saw when she re-examined the cartographer's map in her memory. 12 names around the compass wheel, each connected by crime, by fate, and all culminating in the final point. His own. She had disrupted the pattern. She had tracked it down, exposed it, derailed it, and thus she had become the ultimate transgressor of its twisted logic. But if she was the 12th, then someone else had written that final name, which meant one thing. The 13th point cartographer would never be judged, unless she turned the compass towards him. By nightfall, she had returned to Widow's Cliff, camouflaged again, but this time not as an acolyte, as a saboteur. The fire still burned in the ritual, torches, 11 of them were burning. Only one post remained intact. Miss Marple discreetly placed a small leather case under the last torch. Inside, a broken compass, with the name Clem Yarrow engraved on its dial, the man who had plotted the entire murder cycle, but who remained safely behind the curtain, his hands clean. He looked up. Delphine Croft was standing beside him, as if summoned by the scent of betrayal. "I thought you ran away," Delphine murmured. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Underground, where their cartographer lives." Delphine's face twisted. "I've seen your maps," Miss Marple continued, "your justice, and I've seen the needle of your compass point toward anyone who causes you trouble." Delphine didn't reply. Instead, she offered Miss Marple a small folded piece of paper. "Then you should see this," he whispered. Miss Marple unfolded it. A name. Judith Pike. She looked at him in horror. "Number, he was never a target." Delphine nodded. "Not until last night. The cartographer changed the list. But Judith is... She's hiding in the sacristy," Delphine said quietly. "She's terrified, and she says you're the only one who can prove her innocence." Miss Marple did not wait. He turned away from the torches and ran. Over the cliff, down the wooded path, through the cemetery gates, and into the old stone vestry of St. Dymphana's chapel. Inside, candlelight danced on the pews, and Judith Pike sat slumped in a corner, bruised and trembling. "Miss Marple," he croaked, "they tried to burn me. I heard them say I was the last one, that it had to be me." Miss Marple helped her to her feet. "You're not the last. It's me." He examined the woman's hands, red marks around her wrists. "Rope burns." "You got away from them," said Miss Marple, "and they'll come back to complete the circle." "No," Judith said in a raspy voice. "They said the circle was complete." Miss Marple froze. "What do you mean?" They said the circle ends, with him." It took Miss Marple less than an hour to compare the parish registers, the cartographer's hand-drawn wheel of death, and the list of naval casualties Cray had mentioned during his earlier investigation. One name united them all. Milen Rama of Clem. But not like the 13th judge, like the original transgressor. 20 years ago, Yarrow falsified shipping manifests during the Falklands conflict, diverting supply chains, causing shortages and the preventable deaths of 17 sailors. He was captured and dishonored, but never prosecuted. Instead, he reinvented himself as the cartographer of justice, hiding behind his maps, behind doctrine, behind people like Eliza and Delphine who craved order more than law. But what was gnawing at Miss Marple's mind was this. If he was the source, then he had constructed this entire ritual to absolve himself. 12 sacrificial deaths to balance a great guilt. He had created a logic so powerful, so seductive, that others would kill for it. And now the final fire burned. The circle was closed. Miss Marple was no longer a victim. Now she was the only person left outside. He returned to the barn cellar at midnight. Clem Yarrow waited with a lit lantern, maps unfolded, inkwell full. He didn't seem surprised. "I thought you'd come back," he said. "You never planned to kill me," she replied. "You planned for me to survive, as a witness, to bless the cycle." Yarrow nodded. 12-1, he said. "Balance, harmony. The burden of guilt must be redistributed." He took a step forward. "And your fault. I carry it with me," he whispered. "Every day." "No," she said, her voice hard. "You externalized it. You made others feel righteous by killing for you. You offered them clarity, symbols, the illusion of justice." Milen Rama's hand went to her compass. "And yet," he said softly, "it points away from me." Miss Marple stepped into the circle of light and dropped her compass on the table. It spun wildly, without true north. The glass was broken, and the needle was bent. "A true compass doesn't point to blame," he said. "It points north." Yarrow's fingers trembled. He searched for something under the table, but Miss Marple had already moved. He knocked the lantern off the table with a swift hand, plunging them into darkness. In the same motion, he kicked the back leg of the drawing stool, knocking Yarrow off her feet. A flash. He pulled out something metallic. A compass. No, a dagger forged from the brass casing of an antique naval compass. Miss Marple dived. The blade grazed her shoulder. She rolled, kicked, snatched the compass box from his hand, and smashed it against his temple. Yarrow collapsed. The light came on and the door swung open. Delphine Croft and 2 officers burst in with their rifles raised. Miss Marple stood over Yarrow's body, bruised and breathless. "The cycle ends with him," he said. Delphine's expression creased as she looked at Yarrow and then at the twisted compasses on the table. She took a step back silently, and he nodded. 2 days later, Clem Yarrow was arrested under the Naval Offences Act, charged with conspiracy to commit murder and incitement to ritual violence. The evidence found in the barn's cellar was overwhelming. The 11 ritual murders were attributed to 3 accomplices, including Eliza Redfern, each of whom acted under Yarrow's doctrine of moral correctness. All 3 confessed under pressure, though they insisted they felt singled out. Inspector Cray, his leg in a cast and his throat wrapped in gauze, sat beside Miss Marple as the last torch was extinguished on Widow's Bluff. "No more fires," he said. "No more circles," she replied. He looked at her. "You're still bleeding." He touched his shoulder. "I scraped it. That's all." Cray smiled slightly. "You're a force of nature, Miss Marple." She didn't answer. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the horizon, where fog lay over the coastal cliffs. "There will be more," he whispered. "More killers." "No," he said quietly. "More people who think they're saving the world." The letter arrived before breakfast. Carefully folded in 3, it bore no stamp or postmark. Just a name. Miss Jane Marple, scrawled in red wax crayon on a faded sheet of paper, as if torn from the cartographer's own desk. Inside was a single line. "The compass must complete the turn. There's 1 left." Miss Marple's teacup trembled slightly as she read the message. The china rattled against the saucer. The compasses were supposedly broken, their logic exposed, their master arrested. And yet someone still believed. Or worse, someone obeyed. He turned the note over. Nothing. No signature, no stamp. But the smell that permeated the parchment, machine oil, smoke, and a faint hint of ink, reminded him of only one place, the printing press in the basement of the rectory. She stood up immediately. The cellar beneath St. Dymphna's church was cold and walled like a vault. Dust accumulated over discarded pamphlets, and the air vibrated with the faint electricity of old typesetting machines. Miss Marple entered slowly, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. A light bulb flickered overhead, casting long shadows, and in the far corner, someone moved. "Miss Marple." The voice was soft, almost embarrassed. It was Reverend Ingram. I hadn't seen him since the second night after Judith Pike's escape. His sermons had become increasingly erratic before that. But now, with his pale face and askew robe, he looked more frightened than fanatical. "I thought they'd stopped," he murmured. "That the doctrine had ended with Yarrow." "You got one too," he guessed. He nodded. "Mine said, 'The 13th shall judge the 12. Miss Marple inhaled. "They've reversed it. They've turned the cycle around." Reverend Ingram pointed to a table where there were several items. An antique compass with a broken glass dial. A hand-drawn map of the village with 12 houses marked in red. A 13th mark, fresh and damp, placed directly above the vicarage. "They want me to complete the circle," he whispered. "To burn the house down as final penance, including myself." "And would you do it?" Miss Marple asked softly. The Reverend did not respond. Instead, he handed her a third item, a small black box, the kind used for choir donations. Inside, a spent match, still warm. She arrived at Judith Pike's cottage 30 minutes later, flanked by Inspector Cray, who was now limping with a stick, and young Sergeant Fenwick, whose face had turned pale since the discovery of the letter. Judith greeted them with trembling hands. "There was someone on my porch last night," she said. "I thought it was just the wind, but there were boot prints, new arrivals." Miss Marple examined the threshold. Sure enough, mud, oil, and the outline of a metal-tipped heel. "The same boot prints outside the rectory press room," Cray confirmed. "We're dealing with someone who knows the ritual," Miss Marple said. "But it's not someone from the inner circle. They copied the external markings, but misinterpreted the internal logic." "What do you mean?" Fenwick asked. Miss Marple turned to him. "Yarrow's ritual was all about redistribution, twisted justice, yes, but orderly. This copycat is reactive, chaotic. They've taken Yarrow's doctrine and personalized it." "What do you mean?" Cray pressed. "That is to say," he said gravely, "we are not dealing with a disciple. We are dealing with a fanatic." That night, a fire broke out. Not in a house, but in the old windmill on the outskirts of town, where Miss Marple had found the first trace of the compass ritual. The firemen managed to extinguish it, but the message was unmistakable. Scrawled in charcoal on the door was the following message: "The judge must fall." Miss Marple returned to the map. She plotted the 12 deaths, then the 13th point. Then she did something no one had dared to do. She drew a 14th. "Miss Marple?" Cray asked, watching her. He touched the new spot, the post office. "It's central, invisible. It affects everyone else," he said. "It's where the letters were sent. It's how the killer knows who to threaten." Cray blinked. "Hargreaves?" The postal worker. Calm, efficient, near retirement. "She took care of every one of those letters," Miss Marple said. "It wouldn't be easy to slip one through a slot, deliver it in person, and remove a mark without anyone noticing." "But why now?" Cray asked. "Yarrow's behind bars. The network's dismantled." Miss Marple stared at the map. "Because Yarrow believed in guilt," he murmured. "But this person, this killer, believes in purity. They're not following the map. They're purging the village." Cray and Fenwick moved quickly. At dawn, 3 officers were guarding the post office, but Hargreaves was gone. His bike stayed, his cat too, but his coat and his ledger were gone. Miss Marple entered the building behind them. She noticed details others missed: the stack of unused envelopes, each one handwritten, the small crayon stain on the corner of the desk, the faint smell of smoke under the floorboards. Then she saw him. A compass. Yarn. It wasn't cracked. It wasn't even old. It was completely new. And everything was ready. The trail led north through coastal forests toward the cliffs above Widow's Bluff. There, in the morning twilight, Miss Marple saw that the last torch had been relit, and at his side was Hargreaves. His face was covered in ash. His eyes were bulging. "You disrupted the balance," the woman said, her voice trembling. "Yarrow was weak. She regretted it, but the compass must turn until the poison is gone." "There's no poison," Miss Marple said calmly. "Only fear. And it's eaten you away." Hargreaves raised the compass high. "This is the 13th death," he whispered. Miss Marple took a slow step. "If you light that torch, someone will die, but it won't be me." Hargreaves hesitated. "Because I know where the compass points," Miss Marple said sweetly. "It points to those who think they can judge others." Hargreaves' hand trembled. Then he dropped the compass. It shattered. Just as Fenwick and Cray reached the cliff, they drew their rifles. Back in the town square, the last fire was extinguished. Hargreaves was detained, muttering verses from Yarrow's pamphlets, alternating between tears and rage. Miss Marple sat back down next to Judith Pike. "You broke the circle," Judith said softly. "No," Miss Marple replied. "I simply refused to walk it." Judith reached into her pocket and handed Miss Marple something small and bronze. It was the compass from the original widow's compass, the one from the cabinet, the real artifact, a tool, not a weapon. Miss Marple turned it slowly in the palm of her hand. It was pointing north, just north, as he had always done. The whisper spread before dawn. This isn't over. Despite Hargreaves's arrest, fear gripped the town more strongly than ever. She had been the torchbearer, yes, but her notebook, discovered in a false bottom under the post office counter, told a darker story. Names, dates, and coordinates, each circled in red, with a final sentence written underneath. "I'm just a dot on the wheel." That was what really scared Miss Marple. Hargreaves had not been acting alone. The compass cult, thought extinct, had splintered, not died, and the splinters were harder to see until they were embedded. Miss Marple sat by the fireplace in the vicarage, holding the broken compass Judith had recovered. Its arrow still pointed north, stubborn and silent, even as it spun in irregular circles. That was the flaw, wasn't it? A compass should guide, but this one was corrupted. It didn't point to safety. It pointed to obsession. She had to use it against them. "I want to arrange a funeral," he told Inspector Cray over tea. He blinked. "A funeral?" "Yes. For me." Cray stared. "You've been threatened 3 times this week, survived a firebombing, an attempted beating, and nearly fell off Widow's Cliff. And now you want to announce your own funeral." Miss Marple stirred her tea calmly. "Exactly. Publicly. With date and time." Cray looked at Sergeant Fenwick, who seemed equally skeptical. "And what do we say to the people?" "Tell them I've had a relapse," he said simply. My heart ached from the stress. The funeral will be behind closed doors, at night, and most importantly, unguarded. Fenwick raised an eyebrow. "You're provoking them." "Exactly," he repeated. "If this group sees me as the final obstacle, they won't be able to resist. They'll finish what they started, and I'll be waiting." Preparations began in the afternoon. A notice from the village was discreetly posted on the parish hall board: "Memorial service for Miss Jane Marple. Thursday at 9 p.m. Chapel of St. Dymphna. Closed to the public at the request of a family." That night, Judith Pike wept in conviction in the bakery. In the morning, 3 wreaths appeared outside Miss Marple's cottage. 2 anonymous, one with a card that read, "She resisted the compass, but we all returned to true north." That was all the confirmation I needed. Thursday, 8:45 p.m. The church was dimly lit. Candles cast flickering shadows on the stone walls. A simple wooden coffin rested near the altar. There were no mourners, no hymns, only silence. Inspector Cray and Sergeant Fenwick crouched behind the vestry door, revolvers in hand. Judith Pike stood in the back entrance, clutching a lantern, her knuckles white. Miss Marple, very lively, sat quietly in the organ loft, with a dark shawl over her head and her eyes fixed on the front pews. The trap was set, 20:58 hours. A creaking sound echoed in the chapel, not from a door, but from under the floorboards. Fenwick signaled. Cray tensed. Miss Marple leaned forward. A panel behind the altar moved. From the darkness emerged a thin, cautious, hooded figure. Not Hargreaves. Taller. Supplemental, one of those people who move as if they leave no trace. The figure approached the coffin, on pause. Then they took out of their coat a bronze object, a compass. They placed him gently on the coffin and lit a match. Miss Marple rang the bell from above. The sound echoed like a scream. Cray left the vestry. Fenwick followed him. "Police! Hands where we can see them!" But the figure was thrown out, passing through the altar panels and falling into the crypt below. "Basement exit!" Cray shouted. Judith opened the back door just in time to see the figure running through the cemetery. Miss Marple walked calmly down the stairs. "They knew the hidden path," he said. "They had used it before." The chase led them through muddy paths to the abandoned schoolhouse next to the mill. Inside, a rudimentary sanctuary had been constructed, half-burned pamphlets, candle stubs, a copy of the Compass Doctrine with passages violently underlined. But what caught Miss Marple's attention was the map. It was different. It's not just a map of the town, but one with dates superimposed on each location. Future dates, and the next one was circled in black. August 29th, Children's Hospital Fundraiser. Miss Marple's heart sank. "Tomorrow," she whispered. "They're planning a strike at the fundraiser. It'll be packed." Cray paled. "We have to evacuate." "No," said Miss Marple. "We have to catch them." Friday, 6 p.m. The hospital lawn sparkled with bunting and colored lights. Children ran between the stalls, balloons floating. Music played on a crackling gramophone. But everywhere, plainclothes officers watched from every corner. Cray and Fenwick patrolled with radios in hand. Judith Pike stood near the cake stand, her apron stiff with nerves. Miss Marple, disguised in a nurse's cap and glasses, stood near the punch table. Then, at 6:27 p.m., a scream. "Fire!" Smoke rose from the north corner of the field. As the crowd rushed to see, Miss Marple did not move. She looked at the southern end. And there, gliding through the chaos with a box of matches and a compass in his hand, was a man he recognized, Mr. Linton, the retired teacher who had disappeared after Yarrow's arrest. He moved confidently, torch in hand. She stood directly in his way. "Not this time," he said. He froze. "You're dead." "No," she replied. "Just smart enough to play." The officers approached. Linton reached into his coat for something, but Fenwick tackled him hard, sending the matchbox flying. In custody, Linton confessed to everything. After Yarrow's fall, the doctrine fragmented. Hargreaves preached purity. Linton, revenge. They formed rival sects, each convinced it was the true compass. The school map had been her plan. The fire was the first sign. Miss Marple had been the last to be scheduled, but her death upset everything. She had rushed the schedule. His last words before he was taken away left them all frozen. There are always 12. The 13th is simply the one who sees. That evening, Miss Marple finally returned to her living room. The broken compass lay on the mantelpiece, like an arrow spinning forever. Judith poured the tea, her hands still shaking. "Do you think it's gone?" Miss Marple took a thoughtful sip. "Number, but I think the wheel has stopped turning for now." Then he put the compass in a drawer. I blocked him, and he firmly pulled the key out of the lock. The town gathered at dawn under the grey blanket of a cloudy sky. Police patrols had left St. Mary Mead during the night, taking away the last compass cult sympathizers. Rumors fluttered among the neighbors like birds on a wire, names, denials, old debts resurfacing. Everyone had someone to suspect. But Miss Marple wasn't finished. She knew something was wrong. The numbers didn't add up. Linton, Hargreaves, Yarrow, Mrs. Brackley, and 2 others from the sanctuary. Their sect claimed to have 12 members. 6 had been caught or confirmed. 5 had been accounted for and cleared. But that left one. The 13th, the one who sees. That morning, he pored over Linton's confiscated notes, repetitive language, rhythmic phrasing. But one sentence had been scrawled more violently than the others. The observer completes the circle. When 12 believe, the 13th advances. The observer, Not a leader, not a killer, the one who knew everything. And Miss Marple had a suspect. He waited until noon, until the fog lifted enough for the sun to cast thin shadows over Widow's Bluff. The perfect place for a reckoning. He asked Judith Pike to deliver a message, privately and discreetly, to the one person who had insisted on remaining silent throughout the investigation, Mr. Everett Cheetham, the affable director of the Historical Society. He arrived exactly at 12:15, punctual to the minute. "Miss Marple," he greeted, carefully removing his gloves. "Judith said she wanted to talk to you, on a cliff, no less." She gave him a tight smile. "Forgive the dramatics. I think high places are great for clear conversations. Nothing like staring off the edge, to be honest." Cheetham laughed nervously as his eyes darted towards the drop. "I must say," he continued, "I had no idea you were still alive. What a performance!" "I've had a lot of practice," he said. He answered, now that the main actors had left the stage, "I thought it was time to talk to the playwright." Her smile faltered. "I don't understand you." "No? You followed everyone very closely. Their finances, their routines, their correspondence. I reviewed your society records yesterday. There are fascinating details in your minutes, especially those of Mrs. Brackley, Hargreaves, and Linton. You even noted what time they left meetings. It's curious, unless you were monitoring their availability for subsequent activities." Cheetham's stance hardened. "Do you think I'm one of them?" "I think," he said calmly, "that you're the one everyone feared most. The 13th, the eye of the storm, the watchman who never got his hands dirty but made sure everything ran smoothly." Cheetham stared at her for a long moment. Then he smiled again, this time without warmth. "You're clever, Miss Marple. You always have been. But you're missing something." "What's that?" "I never planned to kill you." "Not really." Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. "But you planned everything else." Cheetham's voice changed then. Not louder, just deeper. Less pretense, more precise. Yarrow was a fanatic. Hargreaves, a purist. Linton, he simply reveled in chaos. But neither of them had vision. They wanted to raise the world without understanding its architecture. I took the notes. I set the dates. I chose the symbols. "And the victims," Miss Marple said quietly. He did not deny it. They were obstacles. Nothing more. They weren't innocent, of course. Yarrow's wife was a monster in her own right. Pemberton? He blackmailed 2 councillors over housing permits. Every name on that list had blood on their record. We simply balanced the scales. Miss Marple held up a folded piece of paper, the last page of the school map. "You planned one more." He nodded. "Yes, you." And then it moved. It wasn't a lunge, but a flick of the wrist. The small blade emerged before most had seen it, but Miss Marple had expected something similar. She took a step back, not enough to flee, but enough to distance herself from the blade. "I was wondering if you would confess," he said. "Oh, I didn't," he replied. "But I recorded you." One click. From behind a stone pillar, Judith Pike emerged with a pocket recorder. Beside her were Detective Inspector Cray and Sergeant Fenwick, their pistols raised. Cheetham froze. "So close," he whispered. "But not close enough." Suddenly, he turned and ran, not towards them, but along the side of the cliff. Fenwick screamed. Cray lunged at him. Miss Marple didn't move. They heard the crash. Silence fell. They found him 6 meters below, alive but with his legs shattered and his ribs crushed. He looked up as they strapped him onto a stretcher. "I never use the compass to find others," he whispered. "Only myself." Then he lost consciousness. The next few days were a blur. Cray reported that Cheetham would barely survive. He would face trial, although his court days might be spent in a hospital bed. More names had emerged from the documents, distant members, sympathizers in other cities. Miss Marple's work had exposed more than just a murderer. He had deciphered a network. A week later, she was sitting in her garden, knitting without enthusiasm. The seams were shaking more than before. Judith brought tea. "They say you dismantled an entire cult." Miss Marple smiled slightly. Number Y untied the last knot. The others pulled on the rope. Judith sat next to him. "Will you ever stop?" Miss Marple looked over the hedge, beyond the roses, towards the faint line of Widow's Bluff in the distance. "When people stop dying mysteriously," he said. Then, reaching into his cardigan pocket, he pulled out the broken compass, which kept spinning and refused to stop. She gently placed it on the table. "Or when this finally points to the truth." They both looked at it in silence, the needle moving. Lost. The cracked compass lay beside Miss Marple's teacup, its needle still quivering, futilely defying magnetic certainty. In the stillness of her garden, the chaotic days gone by felt both vivid and distant, like a thunderclap that had already passed, but left the air trembling. Inspector Cray had arrived that morning. He wasn't wearing a uniform, but a simple grey jacket, carrying a folder under his arm and a tired look on his face. "They're going to send Cheetham to Holloway's infirmary. He may never walk again, but he'll live long enough to stand trial." He laid the folder on his desk. He kept everything: lists, diary entries, meeting lists, and even a record of how many times each member deviated from ritual alignment. "It's obsessive." Miss Marple didn't seem surprised. He was always very careful. His house is arranged alphabetically. Cray blinked. "Have you been to his house?" "I inspected his stamp collection in 1947. He sorted them by watermark, not by country. Very strange." He took a sip of his tea. "I remembered him when I saw him filling out the withdrawal forms for Mrs. Brackley's library." Cray gave a short laugh, part admiration, part disbelief. "I don't know how you sleep after something like that." Miss Marple looked towards the hedge. "I go to sleep when I finish knitting, or when I think someone else will be awake." Cray nodded and stood up to leave. "For what it's worth, you saved half this village." "Not all of them," he said quietly, "but enough." The town itself remained fragile. Shops reopened slowly. Children returned to school under stricter supervision. The Widow's Compass monument was quietly removed by order of the town council. Mrs. Fern's tea room installed a new floor where Mrs. Pemberton had fallen. No one used that table anymore. A modest and heartfelt service was held for the victims. Yarrow's widow did not attend, nor did Thomas Hargreaves' children. Too much shame, perhaps. Or guilt, or simply a grief that couldn't be made public. Judith Pike delivered the eulogy. She didn't speak of dogma or justice or revenge. Only names, only memories. Miss Marple stood beside the vicar as the bells rang. Each note seemed to mark a liberated soul. That evening, Judith brought a basket of buns and something else, a sealed, crisp, official envelope. "Cheetham's," he said gravely. "He asked the inspector to hand it over to me, but Cray thought you'd know what to do with it." Miss Marple opened it carefully. Inside was a letter and a key, antique brass, stamped with the insignia of the Historical Society vault. The letter was short, handwritten with sharp, angular strokes, greater than one item left. Never used. Just saw. Let whoever sees the truth decide what to do with it. See. They both stared at the key. Judith whispered, "Do you think it's dangerous?" Miss Marple didn't reply immediately. She held the key in the palm of her hand, weighing it as if it were heavier than metal. "I think it's a choice." The Historical Society building was locked, but Cray had already cleared the way. Miss Marple and Judith walked silently through the dusty archives room, filled with the scent of old paper and ancient secrets. Cheetham's private vault was behind a false wall of almanacs. The key turned with a reluctant grunt. Inside, they found a small velvet-lined drawer containing a compass almost identical to the one Miss Marple had on her tea table. But this one was intact, and its needle pointed firmly north. There was also an accounting book. Miss Marple opened it. On each page was a name, a date, and a symbol, a circle with radial lines, sometimes 12, sometimes 13. The last page was blank. Judith looked over her shoulder. "What's wrong?" Miss Marple closed the book. "It's a trial record." He placed the compass inside the ledger, closed the drawer, and locked it. "We'll leave it at that. Let the village move forward without having to look back at every shadow." Judith frowned. "But if someone else finds it?" "You'll find an ordinary compass and a book of meaningless symbols. Nothing more." Judith hesitated. "And the one with the cracks?" Miss Marple reached into her bag and pulled it out. "This is mine. I'll keep it as a souvenir." She carefully placed it back in her bag and turned toward the door. "Come, Judith. It will rain soon." A week passed, then another. One morning, Miss Marple received a package. No return address. Inside was a locket. Inside the locket was a photograph. A young woman with light hair and tired eyes. There was a small note. She didn't participate. She just believed the wrong people. "Thanks for showing that the truth doesn't always have to be shouted to be heard." Miss Marple clutched the locket for a long time. He placed it next to his broken compass, and then she resumed weaving. The people never spoke of the compass sect again. Not out of denial, but because people decided their future didn't have to be anchored to the madness of the past. Widow's Bluff was closed to the public. The sanctuary was dismantled. The garden plaza named after Edith Pemberton was planted with lavender and rosemary, scents that soothed rather than suffocated. Judith Pike became the new director of the Historical Society. She reorganized everything. She removed all materials related to the cult. She placed mirrors where the almanacs used to be. "History must reflect," he said, "but not obsess." Inspector Cray returned to London. Sergeant Fenwick stayed. He was often seen at the tea room, holding the hand of young Grace, who had survived the cellar. They never spoke of it, but his eyes had stopped blinking. As for Miss Marple, life returned to its slow pace. More or less. One afternoon, she received a letter from Scotland Yard inviting her to give a lecture on non-linear pattern recognition in rural crime settings. She laughed for the first time in weeks. Then he folded the letter, put on his hat, and walked into the garden where the roses had begun to bloom again, untouched by human troubles. He paused, looked back at the broken compass on the table, and whispered, "Are you still going around in circles?" He shuddered, but only once. Then I rested, north.